Уважаемые коллеги, мы начинаем. Поприветствуем Василия Григорьевича Якименко, руководитель Федерального агентства по делам молодежи.
Добрый день, уважаемые друзья. Я рад, что все вы собрались. И не хочу затягивать надолго приветственную речь. Все равно это довольно риторическое такое мероприятие. Тем не менее, я хотел бы сказать о том, что вообще быть инноватором, создавать новые вещи, это делать людей более счастливыми, нашу жизнь более легкой и комфортной. Вы всем этим занимаетесь. Хорошо, что в нашей стране существует теперь Сколково, который много сделал для того, чтобы эта встреча ваша произошла. И я очень рад, что во всем мире существуют люди, чья жизнь – это череда непрерывных стартапов, чьи компании своими вещами, своими технологиями давно стерли границы не только между людьми и между государствами, между всеми нами, которые делают мир единым. И одним из таких людей, чья жизнь – это непрерывный стартап, является Стив Возняк, который к нам приехал, и я с удовольствием передаю ему слово. Пожалуйста.
Delight to be here in Russia at this time. I've had a lot of connection with this country in the past, but it's really important to think about what leads to the sort of creativity, the sort of innovation that our companies are known for in Silicon Valley, companies like AppleComputer. And I always like to propose that it's based on internal desires in your heart, things that you think of doing. And a lot of these inspirations come about when you're very young and you have heroes in life. As I travel the city here on tours, I see commendations and statues and plaques on walls commending great people that did great things. And it's very much along those lines that you think, oh, I would like to be one of those great people. I would like to be one of the supermen of the world. Now, when I grew up and our heroes, we had a bunch of electronic kids. We were in a new area that was becoming an electronic area. It wasn't yet called Silicon Valley, but the transistors were starting there. And the transistors being made of silicon. And so a lot of my friends were electronics kids. And we followed the electronics heroes in books. We would build devices of our own. We would run wires down the wall when we were very, very young. The world was going to change technologies. Technology is one thing that always changes. It tends to become smaller, using less power, lighter, more personal. And then Moore's law, of course, is responsible for what we have today in the way of computers doing so much in our lives, making us so much more powerful than we were before. But it all started with vacuum tubes when I was young, and I would build my ham radio sets when I was very young, 10 years old, build ham radios out of vacuum tubes, because with an amateur radio license, you could talk to people far away in other cities, in other states, in other countries, even places like Russia. And back in those times, we in the United States were not allowed to make phone calls to Russia. But a ham radio operator could actually communicate. So a lot of the changes in time, a lot of the things that make us feel powerful about technology are the ones that extend communication to faraway places. Well, in school, it turns out that we were in the space race back when I was young. And people would talk about, whoa, it's rocket science was the most powerful science known, but actually computer science was further out and rarer than rocket science. Fewer young people in school could ever encounter computer science, what computers were about, how to use them. We never thought we would see a computer in our lives because they were so huge. They cost so much money. Only the governments and the military and the big corporations could own computers. And you would never find any information in bookstores around us, in magazines, nothing about computers ever. But my father was an engineer, and I discovered by accident a journal in a hallway closet with some computer articles. And I started learning about binary ones and zeros, the language of computers, and how you can add these ones and zeros. I learned in this journal about logic, little devices that make decisions, more and more powerful decisions the more devices you have. It's like a light switch makes a decision. The light is on or the light is off. A very simple rule. Now, as far as when I was young, we had programs in science called science fairs in our school, where a lot of the students would build projects, put them on display, judges would come and allocate awards. And I decided I stumbled into electronics projects. And it goes up the ladder as you go through time in life. And I started out building projects with hundreds of parts, showing every electron orbit and every possible element of the Earth. Because everything really starts down at the atoms. Everything we have in electronics, even the silicon chips that we have nowadays, really start with an understanding of the atoms. That's what allows us to build better chips and better things. And I decided at an early age I wanted to be an electrical engineer like my father. He convinced me that we engineers were building the new devices that would make life easier, that would let us do more things and give us more power in our homes. And I thought, wow, it's so great. Our great-grandparents had to wash clothes with their own hands, and now we have a clothes washer. How good. And in the end, you have to judge life by happiness. And I thought, well, we aren't really happier. My father would talk about this with me. We aren't really happier as a people than we were 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago. But we're driven by this motivation to create new things. We're born with curiosity. We're born wanting to explore every little object and device we can see from the time we're a baby. And we want to create new things, so that must be the purpose of our humankind, is to create these new things and eventually get to a world where everyone has everything so easy. It almost sounds like the heaven that socialism could promise. So I'm sitting there thinking, I want to be an engineer. And then I built another project, and it was a decision-making project. Well, games are fun. Everyone understands games. A simple little game with X's and zeros called tic-tac-toe. If you follow the right set of rules, you never lose. Every rule, I learned how to make one little thing called the logic gate out of one silicon transistor. My father got a lot of transistors given to us because he worked for one of the early aerospace companies, Lockheed, that was the only people that could afford the early silicon. So he had connections with the silicon companies in what is now called Silicon Valley. And so I had hundreds of transistors soldered onto little nails that I pounded into a piece of wood, and each transistor made a decision as to where to make my moves in the game of tic-tac-toe. And this was just a science fair project when I was 10 years old. Moved up from there, and I thought, I didn't know what a computer was. I was very shy. I was one of those people that is afraid to talk to other people. I was not social. And I was afraid, how would I learn about what computers were? I was on a goal, a mission, to find out what a computer was sometime in my life. I knew it was my passion, that I would work with computers forever. I would love them. And I didn't think I'd ever have a job. I didn't think I'd ever have a salary. I didn't ever think I'd have awards or a title. I would just do it on my own time for fun because I loved it. I discovered that almost everything you can learn that's in a computer, you can learn when you're 10 years old. There is no advanced mathematics. You have to learn a lot of stages of mathematics before you're up to calculus and differential equations and the sort of things that can solve quantum physics and real engineering problems. So I decided that I was going to love these computers forever. But I didn't know what a computer was, and I was too afraid to ask people. And we didn't have books. I'd look in bookstores. I never saw a book called Computers, or I would have instantly picked it up and read every page I could. So going out to these science fairs, I would see other projects, and it finally clicked in my head one day. A computer does one small little thing, but it does it one after another, after another, after another, very fast, at the speed of electronics. And that's what makes a computer powerful. And I built one project in school, and it could add and subtract numbers in binary, ones and zeros. You would flip these switches to ones and zeros, ones and zeros, ones and zeros, and some lights would light up with the answer. And I thought, good, calculating is one of the things computers do, but it wasn't really a computer yet. When I was in high school, we had a great electronics course, and the teacher there said, Steve, you know all of our electronics. I was very smart in math and science and electronics. I already knew it. I had a ham radio license many years before. So he said, he arranged for me to go out to a company in the industry from my school. he didn't set the borders. Normally a school says the borders of your education are in our school. They are the pages in our book that we do every week. They are our teachers, and that's all we give you. But this teacher was so good, he found a way with engineer friends to allow me to go down and program a computer that could do 1 million things a second, when a person, a human being, could only do one a second. And I went down thinking, wow, this is great, and I learned how to put a program into this computer. In the old days when you punched out little cards with holes in them and fed them into a machine and it printed somewhere. Wow, I was the most special kid in my school because I was programming a real computer. Nobody else knew it, but I thought, wow, I'm gonna solve a chess problem. I'm going to divide a little chessboard up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rows and 8 columns. I'm going to bounce a knight piece around the checkerboard, trying to hit every square exactly once. It's a problem called the Knight's Tour of Chess. And I said, well, when I get stuck and I don't have the answer, and I don't have any place to move the knight, I back up and try something different. And I backtrack, and I backtrack, and try something different. And I'm doing things 1 million times a second. Gosh, I'm going to get an answer, and nothing came out of the computer. And I waited for minutes. I waited half an hour. Nothing came out. I finally went home. I printed chessboards out. I finally discovered that my program would not necessarily have a solution for 10 to the 25th years, longer than the universe has been around, on a computer that could do 1 million things a second. And now our computer could do 1 billion. It doesn't matter. What you needed, I decided what you needed was a clever approach, an algorithm, a method to solving problems that comes out of the human brain. The computers were never going to really think the way the brain thinks. To this day, we really don't know enough about how the brain works to build a computer deliberately that thinks. I'll get to more on that later. So anyway, that was one learning I had. When I went to college, Introduction to Computers was a graduate level course. But I was enrolled in engineering and I was allowed to take the course. And I got an A+, the top grade, but I wrote every program I could write to calculate those mathematical numbers that all the scientists used in their handbooks, and looked up numbers of logarithms and Fibonacci numbers, powers of 2. And I wrote programs to calculate pages of these without running the computer out of time. Every time I ran 7 programs, it would print 60 pages for each of the 7 programs, and then I would rerun the program another time, it would print the next 60 pages for each of the 7. And I could usually get 3 runs a day, piling up reams of computer output paper in my dorm room. And they shut off my programs. They stopped me. I had to go see the instructor. I didn't understand that the class had signed up for a certain amount of time on an expensive computer. And I had run our class 5 times over its financial budget. And it was a lot of money in those days. Very scary. Well, the next year I went to a different college. I was afraid they might try to charge me the money. I went to a different college, and a friend of mine duplicated the key to the computer room. And we would go in at midnight. We would unlock it. Nobody knew we were in there. We would turn on this big IBM computer system, and I would start punching my cards out and running them through and writing programs to change programs into other ones and doing all this stuff night after night after night. I just wanted to use a computer. I took every class in computing they had in that school, even the ones that wouldn't carry any credit on my degree. I just wanted to program day in, day out. I went to the computer store. The bookstore in the university, and bought every book I could on computers. I still didn't think I'd necessarily do this for a job in my life, but I wanted to do it. I just loved learning about computers. While I was programming computers in high school, I stumbled on a manual that described the architecture of a computer. And the architecture of a computer is much like the architecture of buildings. Certain holding spots of certain sizes, and certain doors and rules where you can walk and how things happen. And I discovered this manual, and I thought to myself, this is a real computer that is made by a company. And I said, I know all this logic design from my early school, the science fair projects. I wonder if I could sit down on paper and figure out on my own how to design the computer. No books, no teachers, nobody else that knew a thing about it. I was all alone. I would just shut the door in my room, my little room at home, and I'd start working on paper with a pencil and working out ideas. And then eventually my father gave me some chip manuals
from some of the new chip companies. They were starting to make chips. Wow, I remember going to a show and somebody held up a little picture of a bunch of blocks that looked like buildings and roads, and he said, this is a chip we're going to make with 6 transistors on one piece of silicon. Wow, I saw the start of the chip industry when I was way too young to ever know what it was. And now I went to my dad and I said, wow, I've got this little 6 transistor radio, the most important thing I've ever had in my life. I can turn on music stations. I can sleep next to it and listen to music all night long. This transistor radio has 6 transistors. Now they're going to make better ones out of chips, right? And my father said, well, no, the world doesn't work that way. The new technologies, chips were the new technology of the day, they cost so much. Only governments and military and big business can afford them. In the space race, every little fraction of a gram mattered so much that chips with 6 transistors on it saved weight. They were very important for launching satellites and missiles and things that my father worked on. But somehow we normal people, we would only get, after many, many years, surplus. Extra parts would flow out. And we would get the extra parts to use for our own appliances at home, the things that we love as people. So, and I thought, darn, you know, I thought the people's needs in the homes should be placed number 1. I thought governments were all about helping the people have a better life. Well, it's kind of interesting because today, the state of the art of chips that are made, the most powerful processors, are made for personal computers, for people, and for video games of all things, for young game players. So we've really come full circle, and now it's military, and it's NASA launching, you know, and the International Space Station. They're using parts that were really developed for consumers. So we've come full circle on that one. Well, I went off after my second year of college, where I sneaked in and kind of used the computer. To me, a computer shouldn't have been sitting there unused. If a student has a mind and wants to use it, they should go in and use it. It should not just be set with the power turned off. So the next year, I wanted to pay my own way through college, just my own. I didn't want to borrow money for college. So I went and I got a job in the summer, and it lasted a year-long job programming a computer. I walked into a door by accident, and oh my gosh, I saw them building a computer. Like all these ones back in high school, I started designing computer after computer after computer after computer on paper. No books, no instruction, I taught myself. And I got down to where my design, I tried to make it fewer and fewer parts every time I designed a computer, because less means you used your brain to get more out for less in. And that's efficiency, that's what engineering's all about, and I was going to be an engineer. Well, here I walked into a door and they were building a computer. I said, my gosh, I applied for a job, they hired me. And so I programmed for a year there, and I told one of the executives that 5 years before, back in high school, I used to design all the computers in the world, from Hewlett-Packard, from Varian, from Digital Equipment, from Data General. And he said, oh, well, I can get you the chips. I said, I could never afford the chips. Could never afford a single chip for my own computer to build one. This executive got me some chips. I went and designed a computer that night. He got me the chips for it. It was a small computer with 8 little switches, ones and zeros. You toggle the switches to a 1 or a 0, push a button, and those ones and zeros would go into something called memory. And then you could toggle some more ones and zeros and push them into memory, and eventually you got enough ones and zeros into memory that if you were a computer geek, you knew that that was a program. And I could run this little program on my little tiny computer. And I was so proud of it. The guy that I was building this computer with said, you have to meet this other friend that went to the same high school as us, Steve Jobs, because he knows the digital electronics or works in it, and he also likes to play jokes and pranks and fun things at the high school just like you do, because I was well known for that. So Steve came over on the sidewalk and we started talking, and we had so much in common. We shared our ideas. We loved to play tricks on the school, because the school was like authorities, and it was a little bit of a form of misbehavior, a minor form of what you might call hacking. And then Steve and I talked about our digital stuff, and I talked about all the computers I ever designed, and how the most beautiful computer of all, I told my father, someday I was going to own a 4K computer of my own. And he said, it costs as much as a house. And I was stuck, I was stymied, and I said, oh, I'll live in an apartment. I was going to own a computer someday in my life, even instead of a house. Well, Steve and I got along for quite a bit. We loved occasionally talking about the electronics, the new parts that were coming out, and where they might take the world. This was counterculture times in the San Francisco area of the United States. A lot of talk about living life differently than had been before. The hippies were around, drugs and things like that. I was pretty much feet on the ground, but I enjoyed the talk about people that wanted to overturn society and make it different than it was and improve things. You are like that when you're young and you're looking for your ways in life. Steve was more of a true hippie, and he would dress with almost no money and hang around with people who had no money. He would wear no shoes or just sandals, eat little seeds, and he was going to search for his ways in life, but he was going to be very, very poor while he searched. And he always spoke about the great people that moved us forward, that there were very few people who really moved the full world forward. So he always wanted to be one of those people. What did I want to be? I wanted to be the greatest computer designer of all time. So we went our ways. I came my third year of college at Berkeley, and I discovered by accident that you could put tones into an American telephone and call anywhere in the world, any country, for free. There was a mistake in the phone network that allowed you that simply to take over the phone network and make calls with a little device called a blue box. And Steve and I discovered this, and we didn't believe it at first, but we verified it was real and true. You could call every country in the world except Russia. No, if you typed in country code 8, you did not get to Russia. I'm sorry, no calls would go through there, but everywhere else. And so we had fun, and it was like technology can have this little unexpected fun side where you're able to do things you shouldn't have been able to do. So in designing that device, it was for myself. It wasn't for a company. It wasn't for a grade in a class. It wasn't for a salary. It wasn't for any reward people could see. It was just a reward in my own self, my heart and my brain. I worked so hard, and I thought deeply. I wanted to build the best circuit I could ever come up with. And I was good at saving parts, having very few parts, very few chips in a project. But I thought, you know what? You're putting a bunch of inputs into chips, telling it what tone to make. And I said, every input on this kind of a chip, I know how the chips are made, because I've studied these things, I've looked into them. The chip is actually putting a little bit of electricity coming out of those things called inputs. So an input could be an output. And then I used that output to turn on a device that turned the whole chip on. It's very weird. When you pushed a button, the chip turned itself on even though it wasn't on. It was able to supply the power to turn itself on. Very strange. If you go through very logically and you analyze where all the electrons move, it totally made sense. It totally had to work, yet it could never be in a book. This is the thinking out of the box structure. It could not be in a book. It could not be allowed as a project in a company. It could not be allowed as a project in a school that was done correctly, and yet it was going to totally work every time. By understanding little bits of parts that they weren't designed to be used that way. So that's a lot of what it is looking for your own ways to do things. If you're already brought up and you know, here's how I solve a technical problem, you take that approach, you aren't going to discover the really new, startling improvements. But you have to have a reason, and the reason has to be personal. It has to be something you want for yourself. Around this time, the hottest project in the world, the hottest gadget, was the HP 35 scientific calculator. The first handheld calculator ever that could calculate scientific numbers like logarithms and sines and cosines. You could punch digits in and see the answer. Within a few years, there weren't going to be any more slide rules sold, at least in the United States. Every scientist, every engineer had to have this expensive calculator instead. It was the hottest project of its time. It was the iPhone 4 of its day. And I saved all my money and I managed to buy one. And then the company, Hewlett-Packard, heard about me. They heard I was some kind of hot designer. They brought me in for an interview. They hired me on the spot to be a designer designing these calculators. What an unbelievable lucky thing in my life. Now I could sit down and do what I love doing, do it so well, be paid for it. I could have my own apartment, and I had a wonderful life. But I was very much an electronic genius, and I had little hope of ever having a girlfriend or a wife. So when I came home from work, what did I want to do? I'd watch Star Trek, I'd eat a little dinner, and then I would go back and start working on projects of my own. I always wanted to be doing things with electronics, with technology, things that other people weren't doing. I saw the game Pong, the first arcade video game, in a bowling alley, and I said, oh my gosh. One thing I had never solved in my quest for computers was the expense of input and output. I could now get chips. I could get chips very affordably. I could build any circuit I wanted out of chips that put signals on wires, but you never had a display that was affordable. You never could afford to make a printer. You couldn't even really afford to buy these teletypes you see in movies that people type on. They cost more than cars. Well, all of a sudden, I realized I have a television at home. Here's a video game, Pong, and I have a television at home. Television didn't have video input then, but I was electronic. I would unscrew the back of the TV and play around and avoid the high voltages, and I would run a wire in, and I could put pictures on the screen out of my own little design, put little timing signals for when the lines end and when the frame ends and you go to a new frame. Put those signals on, and sure enough, I could display balls and paddles, and I built a little Pong game of my own out of 28 $1 chips. Simple, low-cost solution. Using my own home TV, that was the answer. So it was a huge step to do that. Well, Steve Jobs had been up in Oregon and going to college. When I took him up to college, he did not like the fact that they told him what classes to take. He wanted to choose his own classes. Shakespeare, calligraphy, quantum physics, that sort of thing. You know, he didn't realize that when you go to college, you have to take their classes, just like in high school. So he came back from college, and for a while, he never really attended, but he lived up there for a while with friends. And when he came home, he saw my Pong game. He ran it down to Atari, the company that made these early arcade games. Atari was located in Los Gatos, California, the city I live in now, a very famous city, because we also invented the pet rock there. And so Steve went to Atari with my Pong game, and they hired him. And they hired him, and he worked for a while, and people kind of didn't like things about him, so they put him on the night shift, where he worked all alone. And I could go in, see the new games, and play them out and get good at them. And Steve came to me and said, hey, they want a one-player Pong game. Can you design it? And I said, I would love to design a game. He says, the trouble is you have to do it in 4 days. Games were not software back then. They were hardware, and it was a half a man-year job. And I didn't think I could do it, but I went without sleep for 4 straight days, and we gave Atari a working breakout game where you hit the ball against the bricks and they disappear. I designed that. And we did it in 4 days and nights. 4 days and nights without sleep. When you're falling asleep or waking up, your mind goes into a very creative state. Sometimes it's a little like hallucinations, you're half dreaming. And you think of things. I was out on the Atari factory floor and I saw a dot on a screen. They only used black and white TVs then. And this dot was going left and right, changing colors. And I was mesmerized, and I was too tired to figure out they put blue mylar, yellow mylar, red mylar on the TV set to make it look like color. But it was hypnotizing. It was almost like a hallucination in color. And I started thinking, color television. I remember from high school electronics. And the signals for color go up and down, smooth little sine wave signal. And it goes up and down at exactly the right rate. A television thinks it's color. And I said, hey, in this digital world, the modern digital world where I'm a good designer, what if I made little digital signals that went up, down, 1, 0, 1, 0, up and down at exactly the right rate? Everything inside of me told me, knowing how televisions were designed, they would see that signal and think it was a color. And then I took a little $1 chip, and I said, if I put 4 1s and 0s in there and circle them around and repeat them, I will have the equivalent of 16 different colors. Would this work? It's never been in a book. Book has never talked about color this way. Color generators would cost $1,000. And I was thinking, I had an idea that might do it with a $1 chip, because I didn't have $1,000. Some of the best things you do in life are because you don't have money and you've never done them before the old way. You don't know how to do it the old way. You have to think of your own approach. This was going to be very key to Apple's success. Steve and I went and saw a friend type it on a big teletype machine to a computer across the country. The United States had developed the ARPANET. They had invested in a network to connect university computers in faraway cities with a network so that researchers could exchange trade data and signals and communicate with each other. And the whole idea was, it was exploring a network someday where if one node got knocked out, they could find other ways around it if there was like a nuclear war. So this ARPANET was developed, and it was the inspiration of today's internet. And I saw you could type into all these computers around the country, and you could run programs on them. And I thought, this is really powerful stuff, reaching out far away, Superman stuff. So I went home and I said, instead of putting balls and paddles on my home TV screen, why don't I put letters of the alphabet on my TV screen, words? And I built a device. I designed and built it out of chips using the minimum parts I could, the least expensive parts I could. A true Wozniak design. I designed a terminal that I could type on a keyboard that I bought for $60. And I could talk to a computer across the country, and it could talk back to my TV. And then Steve was up in Oregon working on a farm, a little a co-op farm that he bought into, and he came home and he saw it. And the Homebrew Computer Club started around this time. Oh yeah, well Steve came home and saw it briefly. He found a way to sell it. It's like every time I designed something for myself, Steve Jobs found a way to sell it. And he sold it to a time-sharing company where companies would dial in on expensive terminals. Now they can have a very inexpensive Wozniak terminal. Around that time, a club started up. Steve went back to Oregon, and I was on my own. I went to this club called the Homebrew Computer Club. And I'll tell you, that was our digital October. That was we spoke about this upcoming revolution where people would be able to afford their own computing machines at a normal human price. The trouble is, the machines you could buy at a human price in that day that was turn them on had all these switches and lights for ones and zeros, and you push the buttons and you get the ones and zeros into memory, and eventually you could get a program in. I had built that computer 5 years before. What was special about it? It couldn't do anything really useful like type a program in. When I told my father I was going to own a 4K computer someday, 4K bytes was the amount of memory to run a real computer language where you typed on a human keyboard. I started watching and thinking, and I said, oh my gosh, I'm going to take my little terminal that talks to a faraway computer, and I'm going to put one of these new computer chips called a microprocessor. I had never worked with a microprocessor. Every step I ever took that created all these great things for Apple, every step I ever took was the first time ever I played with those technologies. Keep in mind, this might apply to an awful lot of young, enthusiastic entrepreneurs and technical people in this country. Steve Jobs and I were in our young 20s. We had no college degrees. We had no business experience. We had never taken a business course in a college even. We had no money. We had no savings accounts. We had no relatives or friends that could loan us money. We had to do everything on our own. So, anyway, I built up this little computer that I could talk to my own television set, and I started demonstrating it down at my club. The club was talking about social revolutions where people were going to be able to communicate over modems with tons of other people. They were going to be able to educate children by presenting information, looking at the answers the child typed in, and tell them whether it's right or wrong, to correct them on the fly, and have much better education. These computers were going to allow us to go into our companies, type in their financial data, and pop out the answers, what the company should do in its economic world, better than their $1 million computers. We young little people who had nothing but computer knowledge were going to be more important than the big officers in the companies were. And that was I just wanted to be a part of this revolution. So I went and designed my first little computer. I took my terminal that talked to a faraway computer, and I put this new little microprocessor chip and a very new type of memory called dynamic memory that I'd never heard of before, but it was the only affordable type for the real job. Put them all on my board, and I took it down to the club, and I would set up during my TV set, and I would type things during our break, and people would watch what I had and look over my shoulder and see very, very few chips. They would realize this is the affordable formula. Every computer before that one came with a front panel full of switches and lights for ones and zeros, and awkward names, and you had to be a computer expert to use them. Every computer since this one, which was to become the Apple I computer, every computer ever since has had a keyboard to type in and a display, video display. So it was a turning point in history. Steve Jobs came back from Oregon and he saw the interest in my machine. I had given it away, by the way. I gave away all of my designs. I gave away all of my software to everyone in the Homebrew Computer Club because they were part of what wanted to build these machines and tell the world that the future was going to be different. We were going to take over. The big computer companies said we weren't going to go anywhere. It wasn't worth anything. The jobs their big computers did, our small ones could never do. And that spurred us on. We felt it was more of a revolution. Well, Steve Jobs came back and he said, look, all these people like your computer, but they aren't technically skilled enough to build it. Why don't we make a PC board that they can get the chips cheaply, plug all the chips in, solder the chips in place, and they're done, and they don't have to really solder wires and stuff. And we'll build these boards for $20 and we'll sell them for $40. And oh man, we'd have to invest a little money, and I didn't think we'd get our money back. And Steve said, for once, the two of us, best friends, would have a company of our own. Who could ever turn that down? So I said, well, first of all, I work for Hewlett-Packard. I'm an engineer. I believe in engineers. I believe they're the best people in the world. They make the things that change the world. Hewlett-Packard is the best company in the world to be an engineer at. I am going to be an engineer my entire life at Hewlett-Packard. I'm not going to go up the management chart. I'm not going to be a manager or an executive. I'm just going to be an engineer because I like to design things and I like to write programs. And I'm going to go to Hewlett. I will never leave Hewlett-Packard. So I went to Hewlett-Packard and I begged them to build this little machine, the personal computer. And they listened and they listened and they turned it down for some good reasons. So they turned me down, and now Steve Jobs and I were in business. I sold a calculator for a few $100s. Steve sold a van for a few $100s. We paid a friend money to design this PC board that we were going to sell for $40. We'd make them for $20 and sell it for $40. It got made. And then Steve Jobs called me at work and he said, I got a $50,000 order. That is the biggest financial shock of my life to this day. Biggest financial shock in Apple's history to this day. $50,000 was scary. It's almost like you have a little company, a business, when you thought you were just doing it for a joke, for fun. And it was twice my salary. It was a lot of money. Went to Hewlett-Packard's legal department. I wanted to make sure that I could still work at Hewlett-Packard and have a company on the side, AppleComputer. So, and Hewlett-Packard didn't want it. They turned me down 5 times in a personal computer area. So we had to do it ourselves. We started AppleComputer, and how do you build a $50,000 order if you have no money? No money at all, zero. The way we did it, we got the parts on credit. As soon as the parts got inserted in our boards down at a company in another city, they soldered them in place. As soon as that started, we had 30 days to pay for the parts. We drove the computers to the garage. We set up a lab bench in Steve's garage. I would hook them up, the computers hooked, plug in the things you have to plug in, test it out. It might work. If it didn't work, I'd fix it. And the working ones we put in white boxes. Then we would drive the white boxes down to the one computer store that was in our area that gave us the order. And they would pay cash on delivery. So we managed to have 30 days to pay for the parts, and we got paid cash within 10 days. So that was how we ran out of the garage with absolutely no money of our own. The guy at the computer store was really taking the credit, not Steve or I, credit from the banks for the parts. Well, within 3 months, it turns out I had designed this really incredible computer from the ground up that had been in my mind. The first computer, I merely adapted a video terminal to make it a computer, but now I wanted to think out a computer based on my color idea. I didn't know if my color idea would even work on an American TV, but I just suspected it should. It should, by all reasoning, all good reasoning, knowing electronics and signals and how they go. So I built this thing with half as many chips as the Apple I. I combined video memory and normal computer memory into one and came up with a trick with one chip doing all the multiple timing signals for the dynamic memories, and one trick after another, the best of my life. And when I turned it on and typed in a number, a blue square popped up on my TV. And I called Steve Jobs over to my apartment and I showed him. And we looked at each other and we knew we had a revolutionary device. Instead of a $1,000 color machine, we had a nice little computer that could be programmed to play games like Atari built, in color, with graphics, with high resolution. We had pixels in the Apple II. This was an incredible computer. We weren't going to give this one away for free. We were going to start a company. Now comes the issue. How do you, the market was now obviously starting to be seen for these small little home computers, and we could sell 1,000 of them. How do you build 1,000 computers if you have no money? We needed money. We went down and tried to talk some companies into supporting the project, building it inside of their company and giving Steve and I some money and some stock and position, to guide this product to its completion. They turned us down. And then we went to venture capitalists who go around and analyze people's projects and what they're doing. But Steve and I had no business experience. We didn't know how to write a business plan. We didn't know how to make a proposal. We couldn't speak business language. So the venture capitalists, we weren't going to get money from them. And then we ran into this angel, Mike Markkula, an angel investor. He had made a lot of money at Intel, and he had retired at an early age, and he was looking around for other investments and things to do in electronics. He saw this Apple II computer. Mike decided that there was going to be a brand new market. Once every decade, a new product category comes into play, and it grows to become a huge market within a few years. He said we'd be $1 billion company in 5 years. And I found it hard to believe these kind of huge numbers. This was sort of ridiculous. But he finally thought that these home computers in the home, helping people do their normal tasks at home, everything from kitchen recipes to checkbooks, reconciling your checkbook, and things like that. So Mike agreed to invest $250,000 in this project, the Apple II computer. And he said that I had to leave Hewlett-Packard. I loved my company. I want to be an engineer forever. And I went inside my head, and I would not be influenced by money. And I said, I want to design computers in my life. But I can do that on my own time. After work at Hewlett-Packard, I go home. I design computers. I've designed 2 computers and cassette tape interfaces. I wrote a basic language without ever taking a course in how to do it. I love doing these things. I'll do it on my own forever. I don't need a company. So I turned Mike Markkula and Steve Jobs down. And I said, nope, I'm not going to do AppleComputer. I'm not going to do it as a company. I won't leave Hewlett-Packard. And finally, a friend convinced me that I could leave Hewlett-Packard and stay an engineer my whole life. And that's when I decided to leave. That I was going to start Apple, but we defined our roles. I would be head of engineering, because I had designed everything, the hardware, the software, every little bit of the computer. Steve Jobs would kind of run all the little details, making sure that the product was good, kind of learn how to run every division in a company. Mike Markkula, our mentor that was funding us, owned as much stock as Steve and I did. You never hear about him, but he got very wealthy too. And he basically defined what the roles of each discipline in the company were, what kind of people we had to hire. We hired a president whose job it was to make sure everything stayed on track to get things done. Very important to have mentors that are willing to guide young people that don't know what they're doing. So I decided, yes, we'll start AppleComputer, and we went into business with this Apple II computer. And it took over the headlines of the world, and it was very popular, but in those early days, programs were on little cassette tapes. We've come a long ways from there. We went up to floppy disks, we went up to CD-ROMs, we went to DVDs, we're on the internet now, everything's in NAND flash keys. But we started out with these cassette tapes that it would take maybe a minute to read a program into your computer, beep, and then you could run a program and type some numbers in from your checkbook, or whatever you felt like doing at home, or even a game. But it was slow. Now we had a meeting, about a year into business, we had a meeting, staff meeting, and they were going to allow personal computer companies, Apple, Commodore, Radio Shack, the 3 of us, into the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, Nevada. Las Vegas, the city of lights. I've never been there. Oh my God, to see Las Vegas would be incredible. To see all the new electronic projects at the Consumer Electronics Show would be incredible. But we were only going to send 3 people from Apple. Our marketing guy, Mike Markkula, our sales guy, Gene Carter, and Steve Jobs. And I was too shy to say, I want to go, pay my way. The company should pay me to go there. I want to see Las Vegas. All I can say is I'm not needed in the booth. I just want to see Las Vegas. But I'm tricky. I'm an engineer. So I raised my hand. I said, if we have a floppy disk, can we show it? And Mike Markkula said, yes. And now I had a goal. If I could design a working floppy disk, having never designed any disk drive in my life, never worked with a disk drive, never worked with a disk operating system. If I could design one that works, where I could say run programs and they ran, and if I could do it in 2 weeks, I would get to go to Las Vegas, because they'd have to bring me along to make sure it worked. You betcha. You know what? Motivation. It's funny, companies have a lot of ways to motivate employees with salary and stock and things, but there's nothing like a motivation that's personal. I got to work every single day, Christmas Day, New Year's Day, working solid. I developed a scheme. I didn't know how floppy disks were made. Thank God. The best things I ever did in the world were because I had very little money and had to build them with few parts, and because I'd never done them before, and I had to think out my own ways. You know what? A lot of people are afraid. When you grow up, you go to school, and they teach you. The answers are in the book. The answers are the same as everybody else has. You don't write the book. You go to a book, and you find out how something's done. No, you know what? If you're smart, you can actually start to think it out and work it out and write the book yourself. I call it writing the book. And that's what I did on this floppy disk. I did a totally different approach than anybody had ever seen or considered. It would not be in any book or anything, but I knew that the data it sent to the floppy disk would come back and I could figure out what it was. That was all that was needed. So this was another big hit. I had about 7 chips in a disk controller, eventually 8, and our competitors had 50. So I went and I studied their design when I was done. And I said, oh my gosh, mine does more, and they have big, huge, expensive chips that are designed to do the entire job along with their 50 chips. So I knew that I had hit another huge, huge win in the technology world, and I was so motivated. This became a part of me trying to prove who I was. I wanted to make it the most excellent in the world because it represented me. So what I did was, one day I went down to have the PC board made for our little disk controller, and the company that makes the PC boards for Apple was busy. I said, good. I laid out clear Mylar on a drafting table. I took little pieces of colored tape, and I started taping up the PC board myself. A job that, no, the engineer doesn't do. I'm the engineer, I was the technician. I'm going to even lay out the PC board. And when I got done, my PC board was going to have 8 little holes through it, called feed-through holes, to connect something from the top of a board to the bottom. 8 holes. And I looked at the design and I said, oh my gosh, if I had designed it with the shift register going left to right, instead of right to left, I would only have 5 holes. So what did I do? It was that perfection. It was me that I was building. I took the whole thing apart, redesigned the design on paper, laid it out again, the PC board with only 5 holes through it. Nobody would ever see these sort of things, but you want to do things to such a level of perfection when you really care. And I wasn't under some gun if I had to get it done today. I was working until 4 in the morning every morning on it, though. You work hard when you want things done like this. With the Apple II computer, Steve Jobs had his first role in sort of product design. His role was to design the first plastic case ever for a computer. Not design it, but he knew a company that could build one. And he looked at drawings that were done of what it could look like, and he chose ones that looked very good. And so his role kind of started that day. His role forever was going to be the importance of a product is in the quality and how it looks, how its physical outside is designed. And over time, that's really what's made the great products that we have today. A lot of computer geeks like myself want to know what's inside, how much processing can be done, and how much time, and what are the characteristics that are numbers adding up to the specifications of a product. And yet, Apple has really followed Steve Jobs' way, which is the non-computer. He was really not a computer person. He was not an engineer. He didn't design products. He didn't write software. But so he appreciated things that made sense to normal people that weren't the engineers. Engineers have a difficult time giving this up, letting a product be simpler because it's easier to understand. And yet to today's iPhone, you'll find these characteristics in it. I'm just about at the end of my time here, so I'm going to finish kind of quickly. The future. The future, I believe, I started seeing about a year ago. First of all, I thought about the internet. The internet. If you have a difficult question, you used to ask a smart person. Now you ask Google. And you get back tons of answers that no person could give you most of the time. Did we design the internet to replace a brain? No. We designed the internet to connect a few faraway computers so researchers could send messages and then send little data files. And then we started being able to publish things to a lot of the world on the internet. And then along came search engines to find everything. And a search engine winds up being a part of the brain. Not surprising, the internet has about as many nodes and endpoints as we have neurons in the brain, about as many network connections as we have synapses in the brain. So it's the closest thing we have to a brain. But we didn't know, we weren't trying to build a brain, we wound up with it by accident. I think we're going to stumble onto things like computer consciousness the same way. About a year ago, I started using a program that was much more sophisticated and accurate at recognizing your voice. I would do it on different models of phones and speak commands in and have things happen, but I was speaking like a normal human being. I'd like a reservation at the steakhouse for 4 people on Tuesday night at 6 p.m. It would get all my words right, even if I was in a loud, noisy concert, and it would make the reservation. And I thought, this is the way I want to live. I think a thought, I speak it, and it comes to me. We've changed our input methods so greatly throughout computers. Input-output has changed the most. We went from big bulky televisions, well, we went from printers before that, but big bulky televisions in the first personal computers, down to nice thin little LCD panels, and now we've got touch panels. We used to have keyboards, and now we're touching. The voices, the sound of voices is so much greater. I've got a computer in my pocket that is so much more powerful than any computer I could have ever imagined in my life, and it has humanness. It has human senses. It can feel touch, it can feel movement, it can see me, it can hear me. And so I think what we're on the path to do is to build eventually that conscious piece of technology, the conscious computer that you really speak to, and it speaks back as a friend. It notices how your face looks. It knows what kind of questions to ask you. It has hunches as to what things are in your life, and it would treat a different person differently. So I think we're on that road. Jeff Raskin was probably the most important person ever to ask Apple. He came to Steve Jobs and myself. He said, listen, you've got to put a lot of work into your computers to make them so easy to use that non-computer people can use them. The computer person can still use them too, but you've got to put that effort in because the human user is more important than the technology. And that's been the mantra of Apple, to make the easiest to use, most human, most understandable products we can. And that's enough for now. Sorry, we don't have time for question and answers here, but I ran a little over. Thank you very much for your attention.